Very good. I'm very happy that you all came today. Is that better? Okay, gentlemen in the back, how are we doing? We're fine now? Can I creep forward? Okay. I don't want to get in front of them. It's just awful when we get attacked. Our extremely talented and kind sound people were talking about the fact that when it goes well, no one knows about them. When it goes badly, they get all the blame. But I know it's going to be just fine, and we're very grateful. Last night we were talking about Be the Change, which is a campaign that Ananda is running, and today we're talking about Autobiography of a Yogi. How many people have read this book? Okay. How many people have read the blue version of this book?
You mean the orange version?
No. How many people have you read the blue version of this book? Okay. If you've only read the orange version of this book, I will start with a little commercial for the blue version of this book. I have very strong reservations. The orange version has been edited multiple times since Yogananda died, and all in a direction that makes him seem more committed to institutional religion than this version tells you. This is the original version as he published it, with the inclusion, I think the one we sell now includes the single chapter that he changed during his lifetime. I hate to start with politics, but I really encourage you to get the blue book, and the blue book is what I'm going to be referring to this whole time. You know, a master is subject to interpretation, and interpretation is part of the spiritual path because we have to make it personal, but you also have to have discrimination in this. A friend of mine who is an Episcopal priest, he was a priest in Seattle, the Seattle area for a long time, and he has a master's degree in theology from Yale Divinity School. So he's a big mucky muck with a big brain. And he's very, very well informed in Christian theology and Christian history. So whenever I would have questions, I would ask him questions about it. And since Paramhansa Yogananda, Master as I call him, since Master recommended intentional communities, when I was reading the Acts of the Apostles at one cycle when I was really into reading the Bible, I realized that as soon as Jesus died, they all formed intentional communities. That's what they did. And so I went to him and I started asking him questions about, this is an amazing coincidence. What was this about? And he started giving me certain theological stories, including that they thought the end of the world was coming, so they were gathering together because it was the end of the world. The apocalypse interpretation of whether or not the end of the world means the end of my delusion that this is reality, or whether it actually means that this physical place will dissolve. Two very different interpretations from the same words. The second coming of Christ, does he really appear on clouds and everybody can see him around the world, or is it the birth of Christ consciousness within us, which is the return to our own natural state? And it's all very interesting. So my friend was giving me this long story about different aspects of Christian theology, which were not entirely consistent with Master's teachings. I should say he's a Kriyaban and a disciple of Master, and an Episcopal priest. He says the only problem between this teaching and his church is the word only, O-N-L-Y, the only Son of God. And he just kind of passes, he mumbles it, is how he puts it. He would just mumble it, and then he would be fine. But he started explaining to me, because he was, it was what he was describing was not Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma is the eternal truth upon which all great masters have the same experience, and they all really teach the same thing. A master himself has a pure vision, but he incarnates at a certain time and at a certain place to help a certain cultural situation and to help the disciples who come with him. So he has no limitations, but he's limited by the context in which he's born. So Jesus, I'm diverging, but not really. Jesus was born for the Jews, and the Jews had Judaism is a true religion. It's truly based on Sanatana Dharma. I'm going to keep just skipping. Today is Yom Kippur. I was raised in a Jewish family, not a very active Jewish family, but religiously. But I remember once I went with my father to the all-day Yom Kippur services, which it's very hard for most people who aren't adept at concentrating to pay attention. So the rabbi just lets them kind of wander around, and they're just doing all kinds of things sitting in the synagogue. And he was talking, so I'm sitting there, and so I start reading the prayer book, which is really hot stuff. It is full of fantastically wonderful teachings, which it was clear to me the rabbi didn't understand. So I fantasized going up to him and asking if I could have the mic for 10 minutes, because I thought I could really get the attention of the congregation. Enough of me knew that really wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work. But it was all there, but he had lost track of it. So he was doing what people do when they lose track. And so I'm going back to my friend, the priest, and he's telling me all these different things. And I said, but that's not what Jesus, what? And when the first he told me, the full teaching of Jesus was not revealed for several centuries. It was several centuries later that gradually the full teaching was revealed, and so that's what the priests were actually teaching now. I said, now let me get this straight. So Jesus, who was a self-realized master and had complete perception, I and my Father are one, all of this, he didn't know his own teachings. It took 300 years of clergymen to actually understand it. I think it took 300 years to corrupt it. Isn't that what happened? He sort of looked at me like this and said, my life was much easier before I met you. That was what he was taught, and he just offered it to me as if it was true, and he hadn't really stopped to see it in the light of other realities. And he himself is a wonderful man. He's passed from this world, I think, by this point. It is and was a wonderful man and a very sincere priest, and he became a better priest after he became a Kriyaban, because he understood what was in his own prayer books a lot better. But what we're working with, and what we're working with all the time, is that there is an unchanging level of reality. I use the word Sanatana Dharma, which is there's a few concepts that you have to use in other language, because the people who created English weren't interested in infinity, and they didn't know much about consciousness. I only speak English. Swami Kriya Ananda, who was Yogananda's direct disciple, an American man who knew Yogananda directly. Kriya Ananda died at the age of 86 in 2013. And I knew him from 1969 until his passing. And when Kriya Ananda was 22, he met Yogananda because he read Autobiography of a Yogi. He read this book in New York City, and then went to Los Angeles and became a disciple. And I met Swami 24 years after that in California, actually, in Palo Alto, where I live right now, because he was in San Francisco. But he speaks 8 languages, and he talks about the fact that English has more words for everything than most other languages do, and it's extremely precise. And the first time I went to Italy, speaking no Italian, I just kept hearing the same words over and over again. Bella, bella. I said, Swami, they don't seem to have many words for things. He says, no, not as many as we do. Just my naive, complete, chauvinistic little tiny American world. But in any case, Sanskrit was always interested in consciousness. So there's very precise words for consciousness, and sometimes there's no other word. You have to go back there. Sanatana Dharma is one of those concepts. We don't have a concept in English. Sanatana Dharma, in the true tradition of India, that's what they teach. And it's called the eternal religion, or that which is. Even the idea of religion is not indigenous to the Indian culture. Religion is what happens afterwards. First, there is truth, then there is religion. And religion is created by people who generally believe and are dedicated and are very sincere, often quite intelligent and well educated, But they themselves have not necessarily had the revelation. And so they're trying to think, what do we do with what we've been taught? And then they start creating things. And as it happens, we have been in a descending cycle of consciousness after Jesus for 500 more years. Now we're coming up the other side. And that cycle of consciousness was the material age, in which everything had to be put into some fixed form. So you have dogmas, you have rituals, you have rules. And once you start down the path of rules, you have to just keep making another one. I don't mean to be offensive, and I'm Jewish, I'm not Catholic, but a lot of my friends are Catholics. Ananda, as our communities, we have a very high percentage of Jews and a very high percentage of Catholics, born and raised. Catholics because they're devotional, and the Jews because we're always in the forefront of any new movement. And being, kind of like a slightly marginalized group, not seriously, but enough, we're independent thinkers. So we tend to pick it up first. When my father, I've been part of Ananda since I was in my early 20s, and my parents, they alternated whether they liked it or not. I mean, they had a long time, they had a lot of time to shift. First they thought it was cute and they thought it wouldn't last, and then it went on and on and on and on, and then randomly at some point, I don't know why, they just decided to be against it, or they tried that. And I was having lunch with my father, and he was starting in a negative way. And so I said to him, I looked at him, and I'm very fond of my father. He raised me in ways that I'm very grateful for. I said, I thought you'd be proud of me. You raised me to think for myself, and I am. Just like that. Oh. Then I said more seriously, don't even go there. Don't make me choose, because you're not going to like the choice I make. And to his credit, he said, oh, and that was the end of it. I'll give you the last part of it. I'm just telling jokes right now. When my mother decided that she wasn't for it, which this was the same little random period, she suddenly, for the first time, got very Jewish, which we'd never really been that Jewish, but so she starts in with this thing saying, if only we had really raised you in your own tradition, if only we had given you the feeling of who you really are. And I'm thinking I'm helping her by saying, oh, Mom, that's not the reason, that's not why, it's not your fault. I'm going like this. The little voice inside me says, let her take the blame. So instead of repudiating what she said, I said, yes, Mother, what a tragedy. If only, if only, if only. And we kind of did that for a few minutes. The subject never came up again. She needed to settle it somewhere in her mind. And once it was settled, it was fine. And at the very end of her life, they never really knew what I was doing. She was sort of like this. She kind of gazes off into the middle distance and says, I don't know. I just like having you around. Maybe it has something to do with what you're doing. And that was it. And I thought, that's fine. That's all I needed. But we're always acting. Okay, so coming back to where we are with this and talking about Sanatana Dharma, what happens throughout the history of spirituality, if you pay any attention to it, in the West we institutionalize it, in the East they don't institutionalize it, but it still happens. Someone comes with a clear revelation, and the closer you are to that revelation, well, I should say more, the more capable you are of understanding that revelation, the more clearly and completely you receive it. And then people who love it but understand it in their own way start reinterpreting and reinterpreting and reinterpreting, and then it begins to be an institution in which there's influence, and then there's power, and then there's control, and then the motives for people getting involved, even sincere people, it gets all mixed up. And then a whole other tradition gets started, and nobody quite knows where it came from, and it's all given credit back. The whole Catholic Church is built on when Jesus said to Peter, thou art a rock, and upon this rock I'll build my church. Now, Yogananda interprets that to mean that the church was the inner state of realization, and Peter had shown himself to have the intuition to understand who Jesus was, and upon the power of that intuition, He would build the Church of Divine Realization. There were no churches. They were Jews. There was nothing. But now the Catholic Church tells you that that's what it actually meant. And the reason you know it means that is because they said so. And if you don't think about it, that's sort of how it all runs. There's a wonderful little book called I Am a Monk. And it was written by a man named John Tettemer. John Tettemer was a Midwestern American who was raised in a very devotional Catholic way, and from a very young age knew he wanted to be a priest. And in his teens, he went to seminary. And he trained, he went to high school and college, all through in a seminary school. He became a priest. He was very, very bright. He eventually ends up being an educator in the Vatican, has like 25-year wonderful life as a priest, absolutely adores every part of it, totally devoted, loves Jesus, loves being a priest, loves everything he's doing. He overworks and comes to the point, this is all a true story, this is his autobiography. He has a physical breakdown, so the church sends him off to Switzerland to recuperate, and he's strictly ordered to do nothing. No study, no work, no priestly duties. So he sits on the balcony of his pension in a village in Switzerland and just looks out at God's extraordinary creation. Parts of Switzerland really look like they were painted. They don't really look like they're actually there. Swami said it looks like they roll them up at night and then just roll it out again in the morning. So he spends a long time, for the first time in his life, because he was raised on a farm, first time in his life, he's just doing nothing. And he has a mystical experience, profound revelation of the reality of God, the true nature of creation, the true experience of Jesus, everything. And he realizes that the Catholic theology is just made up. And that it just isn't what he now knows Jesus to be. So he has to resign. And he said most Catholics don't even know. He was a theologian. He was highly educated. Most Catholics don't think about it enough or don't know enough about it, but he knew. And it was an absolute tragedy for him. But what a paradox. But he had to resign because he couldn't go any more than that. So he did. And just for the fun, to finish the story, he moved to Los Angeles and he became a movie actor. And he acted the parts of priests and saints. I'm pretty sure he played the Lama in the Lost Horizons movie. And every time they needed a character with spiritual energy, he would play it. And he married and had a family. And he was a very good friend of Amalita Galakuchi, who was a disciple of Yogananda. And it was all in those same years, so undoubtedly he knew him. But but he saw the difference between what Yogananda started calling Churchianity and Christianity, and versus the original teachings of Jesus and the teachings of institutions, and equally so. I grew up, as I said, in America. I didn't even have a passport till I was in my mid-30s. I didn't go to India until I'd been part of Ananda for 15 or how many years it was. It was a long time. And I thought we were Hindus. Because especially in the very early years of Ananda, when Ananda was one rural community, and we just lived, we were totally impoverished, completely isolated, living on in a very undeveloped piece of land. Swami Kriya Ananda himself had lived 4 years in India, and he was still in the Indian mood. Eventually, he felt that his attunement with India was so much greater than his attunement with the West that he actually consciously repudiated it. He stopped singing Indian bhajans, and he stopped wearing his Indian clothes as much, because if he let himself go in that direction, he just couldn't be effective in America. And he felt he was supposed to be effective in America. But in those days, we all had Indian names, which many of us still do. Asha's a name, my mother didn't give me that name and never called me that name, but Swami gave it to me. And he wore his dhoti, and in the summer he'd just go in his dhoti with a bare chest and a string of rudraksha beads, and his hair was long, and we all chanted Indian chants, and it was just like and it was way out in the country, and I would walk barefoot on the dusty paths. I mean, it was a wholly other incarnation, just totally. And I thought we were Hindus. Then I went to India, and I saw Hindu temples and Hindu rituals, and I heard and talked to Indian people, and I realized we were no more Hindu than we were Catholic. And we were just about as much Hindu as we were Catholic, which was that you could see the threads. You could see where the origin points had come from and what was being represented. But Master himself called it a new dispensation. And when Kriya Ananda said to him, "Is this a new religion?" Yogananda said, "No, but it's a new expression." Okay, and that's what we're working with. And that's what we're working with. In the Western tradition, Jesus is unique, the only Son of God. He appeared from who knows where, and he went off to be with God in heaven for eternity. And if you're really good, you get to go up and hang out there for eternity. Swamiji says an eternity in a body sort of like this one, still trapped in your ego, is not heaven as far as he's concerned. That's hell, actually. But there's no context. So Jesus appeared from nowhere and then went away. And so there's no need to really explain him. On the Indian side, where they have known forever, literally, for as far back as history goes, that periodically these great souls appear on earth and offer a message for humanity. Buddha, Rama, Krishna, more recently Ramakrishna, Chaitanya, Ramanuja, there's lots of them. Yogananda is one of them. But periodically they come. And so they have to explain it. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains it extremely clearly. Whenever virtue declines, he says, and vice predominates, I, the infinite spirit, take human visible form to restore Dharma and to eradicate evil. And it just happens every so often, like that. Well, that's what Yogananda himself was. He came at a time of great spiritual confusion to restore Dharma and to restore what he called the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna, and to show that it's all the same teaching. And so he used the phrase, self-realization has come to unite all religions. Self-realization is the unifying reality behind all spiritual paths. And what self-realization is to say, direct, personal experience is what spiritual life is all about. And when he wrote Autobiography of a Yogi in 1946, he came to America in 1920. And he did not publish that book until 1946. And then he died in 1952. So the rhythm that these masters are working on, you would think, well, Autobiography of a Yogi, this is his statement. Why didn't he publish it in 1921? It wasn't like he had to evolve, but the rhythm of how these messages are received, by definition, when an avatar, which is a fully self-realized being, that Jesus in the Bible, once you read the Bible with the self-realization point of view, you see how explicit Jesus was. But to speak of Jesus for the moment, Jesus came to the Jewish people because it was a pagan world. And pagan doesn't mean that you have multiple understandings of the divine. It means that you've lost the connection with true Sanatana Dharma. Judaism did not and never has lost the connection. In expression, perhaps it's a little diluted. But Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's pure Vedanta. It's just the same exact reality. And the Jews were very sincere. And the power. Now, more recent revelations about the Jews at the time have the Essene community as the mystical branch, which was opposed to the institutional branch. And Jesus' argument was not really with the Jews, it was with the corrupt priests whose power and position was threatened by what he taught. And it was all an inter-warfare because his truth was going to ruin their job. I was in Jerusalem for the first time like 2 years ago. And the temple, I saw the remaining wall of that temple, and all I could think of was, this is really huge. I mean, it's huge, massive, physical, fixed. Anybody whose world was that temple was not going to want to hear about any non-materialistic point of view contrary to theirs. I mean, you could just feel how much power was there. And, Jesus was just hurling himself against those rocks, and he knew it. And his real mission happened out in Capernaum and by the Sea of Galilee. And when you go from Jerusalem to there, then all of a sudden, and still you're out in this open, sweet area, and then you really feel what they were really doing. But an avatar, Jesus put it, he was the only one born without sin. That was the vocabulary he used. But the word sin really means karma. And what karma means in this context is all of us, with all due respect to all of you, I'm assuming, forgive me if I'm wrong, but karma is like unlearned lessons. It's something I don't yet know, and therefore I'm forced to incarnate in a material body because there's things I have to learn, experiences I have to have in order to purify my understanding and free me from all delusion. So when Jesus said he was born without sin, that meant he was born without ignorance. And it was his way of saying, I am an avatar, I am a free soul. And so an avatar comes, he has no agenda, no personal agenda at all. He has nothing to learn. It's very hard in the way we all live to even comprehend what it would be to be absolutely still and neutral. I was speaking to someone this morning about Swami Kriya Ananda. He was always neutral in the sense that he could just look at any situation and he had nothing at stake. He needed nothing from any circumstance or any person. And just think, our own needs come in so fast we don't even notice that they've come in. But I was discussing an interaction I had last night with someone where I felt I misread the situation. And my own habit came in before and I was too embroiled before I realized that I was just rolling along with my own momentum and not really reading it properly. And I was saying to my friend, Swami, I never saw Swami do that. I never even heard of Swami doing it because nothing compelled him. He was just still. He didn't have these oscillating waves of I want, I don't want, I need, I don't need. And habit often moves me and most of us. He only moved by intuition. And I just give that as a testimony, and I saw him a lot in a lot of circumstances. He was just still and then would do what was needed. So when the masters come in like that, they are here for us. And they're also here to redirect the planet. And a planet is a pretty mighty object. And there's a lot of different oscillating waves of energy that are all pushing and pulling. And the times that we're living in, we talked about this more last night, where we're in this shift, where everything is getting a lot worse and a lot better, kind of all at the same time. Having been in the spiritual movement from really pretty much from the beginning of the cycle we're all living in now in the early 60s, it's just like mass consciousness has come way up. And at the same time, the popular music is worse. The fashions are worse. The movies are unbelievable. The violence on the planet is stunning. Just like, wow, this whole story is. I remember after the first time I went to Rome, since I got my passport, I've used it a lot. I remember there was some kind of a terrorist attack in Rome, and I'm talking decades ago. This was not Islamic. I don't know who it was at that time, but there was some huge blow up at the Rome airport. People were killed and so on. And maybe a week later, I flew to Rome. And there were soldiers all around holding machine guns like this. And I remember walking through thinking, oh, I'm so glad they're here. And then all of a sudden I thought to myself, my God, these are soldiers with armed machine guns. And I'm just casually walking by, and I'm glad they're here. And I thought, wow, look how things shift. Just inch by inch by inch by inch. And that's what we're working with now. We're working with this sort of force of disintegration and this force that's rising. And this is all exactly what Autobiography of a Yogi is for. And much of it is written in this book or implied in this book. The Master talks about the yugas and the changing time. We're moving from the materialistic to the age of energy, but the transitions between ages. Krishna was born at exactly the same point. The whole Bhagavad Gita and the Battle of Kurukshetra were the spiritual age going into the material age. They were going down. The nice thing about living in a descending age, the great thing about living in a descending age, which I envy sometimes, excuse me, God, is that you just get to leave the whole thing behind. It's just like all going to hell in a handbasket, and so there's no point in building anything. You just go off to a cave, which is what all the Christian people did, the people who loved Jesus. They just went away because they knew it was just sinking into barbarism. And way down around 500, the barbarians swept across and just wiped everything off. And the monks back in the monasteries, saved civilization. The Irish saved it, if you're Irish. Anyway. I have to give credit to Catholics, the Jews, we all have our little part. So the Irish saved civilization. Now we're in a rising age. And so it's appropriate and necessary to participate in the world and to build new systems and set up new models. But we still have all this inertia that we're working with. And so what we're really trying to set is we're trying to set the right threads. And just fascinatingly, this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, in the blue or orange version, you go anywhere that I go to speak, and you ask, how many of you have read Autobiography of a Yogi? And just anybody who's going to be in a room to hear me or my cohorts speaking, at least 75% of the room, sometimes 90% of the room has read this book. How many people are disciples? How many people practice Kriya? The numbers start going down, but how many people have read this book? And how many people who are doing anything of an innovative reality in the field of business or medicine or health, healing, or organic gardening? I mean, just everyone who's part of creating a new society, they've all read this book. And everyone knows, especially I live in Apple City in Palo Alto, that Steve Jobs read this book. And what's very interesting about him also, the founder of Apple, who basically created a great deal of what we're all doing right now. He lived 1.5 miles from the Nanda temple, where I have been for the last 30 years. He knew about us. We have various reasons to know he knew about us. He never came in the door. Not once. But this book, as they say, it was the only book he had on his iPad, and he had conscientiously read it once a year. In other words, the influence and energy of this, nobody owns it. It was to define a whole new way of thinking. And the way, it's phrased in here, helped launch and continues to inspire a spiritual revolution. So some of us, and I know many of you, but not all of you by any means, have felt like not merely that this is good, but this is mine in a very different way. But almost everybody who reads this, okay, let me think where I want to go with it. I think it's very important for us to understand not merely what the words are in the book, but what are the essential themes that he came to represent. And part of it is implied, the original teachings of Krishna, the original teachings of Jesus, the unity of all religions. When people read this book, they pull a few things out of it. We did a little, search engine optimization, which you're always trying to do. What are the keywords that you need to put in, the way you have to advertise and let people know what you're doing. Babaji is one of the most searched words, more than Yogananda. Because you read this book and you hear about this deathless master who even now has his body and he lives up in the Himalayas. And I love this part. He has a few American disciples. Were they born in Iowa? You know, like where did they come from? What was their childhood like? How did they ever get from there to there? You know, there's so many little phrases in this book, like he has a few American disciples, and you're thinking, what? You know, it's just they're marvelous thoughts, but he's so outside, you know, everything. So people remember Babaji, and they really remember Kriya, and they remember Kriya because Master says, you know, this will really, you can do this. And so, naturally, and he wrote the book for Americans primarily. Now it's been translated into every language and the power is really there. But he wrote it for Americans, one, because America is the Dwapar Yuga country. It's the country that is based on, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. You know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, that's really something. Before I traveled outside of this country, I didn't realize how unusual that was. I didn't understand caste and class and tradition and bigotry, and I just didn't understand a whole lot of things until I left, and then I realized what a weird and interesting place this is. You arrive here with nothing, and it's really just up to you. And yes, of course, nothing is perfect, and it can easily be argued that there are many prejudices in place. But nonetheless, Dwapar Yuga is about consciousness and energy. It's not about form. So all of us are consciousness and energy, and have not only the right, but the duty and the opportunity to just take that energy as far as we want to take it. Form is secondary, meaning the race, the country, the culture, the class. It just doesn't matter. You know, my relatives came in through Ellis Island. I was laughing about this. My birth name was Projector, which I doubt really seriously was an Eastern European name. I think somebody on Ellis Island thought it was funny. I was reading a book by Larry Brilliant, whose relatives also came from Eastern Europe, and I thought, I doubt if Brilliant was his name. I think somebody heard somebody say something in Russian or Romanian or Polish or whatever they were speaking and just wrote it down and chuckled, you know, and then that's the family name from then on. But you know, you didn't even have your name. One of my friends, I mean, it's fun being Jewish. One of my friends has her great-grandmother's punch bowl. And it's like a big question as to like when she dies, who will get great-grandmother's punch bowl? And it took me a long time to realize, you have great-grandmother's punch bowl? Didn't your people have to flee? You know? How could you take great-grandmother's punch bowl? You know? But her people never had to flee. You know, it's just like everybody has something different. But you see, America's, you know, the tradition of it. The present moment is less important than the reality of the country. It's a Dwapara Yuga country, is what I'm saying. Master wrote this book for Americans who want a practical approach because we say we can do it. That's how we think. It can be done. We don't have a past, really. Behind us is just wilderness, you know, looking back a couple of centuries. Everything we have, we built. And we want religion to be like that for us, too. We want to have it in our own hands, and that's what Kriya Yoga says. So the first message that Yogananda brought to America, you don't need a priest, you don't need a ritual, you don't need anybody's creed, nobody intercedes for you. It's entirely, spiritual responsibility is in your hands. And what you make of your life spiritually, what your relationship is to God, it's entirely up to you. Now, he does speak simultaneously about the guru-disciple relationship, because that's hugely what the book is about. In fact, the first sentence, Indian civilization has always been, the defining feature of Indian civilization is the search for eternal verities and the concomitant, and almost everyone says guru-disciple relationship, but it says actually disciple-guru relationship, meaning your attitude comes first. But what he's also saying in that first sentence, which is so interesting, is once you start looking for a higher reality, you end up realizing, good God, I need help. And the reason he puts disciple first is because if you don't think you need help, you don't need help. Because you've defined for yourself. And you've defined, I think I can do it, and then you just get to find out how far you can go. You know, my upbringing and when I met Swami Kriya Ananda, it's self-evident, I have a quick and a bright mind. Swami said to me charmingly once, you have a quick and a bright mind and you use it a little too much. So I said, so I have a kind of healthy relationship to it, but I do have it. But as a result, and I was very school smart, you know, and in America, if you're school smart, it's elevated beyond its importance, is the only way I can put it. School smart is just one tiny kind of way to function in this world, but we value school smart. And so I was school smart, school bored, but school smart. So I was expected, there was a whole, you know, big cloud around expectations if you're school smart. And because I was a yogi in many lifetimes, I take reincarnation as the given, I also was completely conscious of the fact that school smart was never going to really make me happy. And that I really needed something that it was not going to give me. So I lived in a very neurotic sort of way. You know, later when I got my horoscope read, I could understand it. But it was like I'm functioning fine and everybody thinks I'm a great success. And inwardly, I'm conscious of the fact that I don't know nothing from nothing. And for a long time, I thought the adults around me all had the big secret. And that when I got to be a certain age, we would all laugh together and they would tell me. So it was really unnerving when I began to realize that they had already told me everything they knew. Which, you know, wasn't nothing, but it sure wasn't enough. But the problem was, I just couldn't find anybody who did know. You know, and this was like, I was becoming mildly but intensely terrified. Just like super, really worried. Because really, if it was going to be all up to me, this was not going to be a good story at all. And that is the search for eternal verities, which eventually leads you to the point, and it wasn't, you see, I never doubted the abilities I did have. It wasn't that I thought, oh, I'm just nothing, I'm stupid, what do I know, I need somebody to take charge of my life. I was doing fine, and I could see that I could navigate this world very effectively, but what would I have at the end of it? So there has to be some point, and these are the important principles that Yogananda is presenting to us. And all this about the guru and the disciple, there has to be a point where we recognize our own limitations and have the humility. That's a very good word, humility. And humility is not self-abnegation. Humility is self-honesty, which is, I'm very good in these ways and I really need help in these ways. And that's really what we're looking for to become a disciple. And when we really want to learn, people will start teaching us. I mean, if you just think about it, every spiritual truth, no matter how high a level it goes to, always has a very identifiable counterpart in our actual experience. I mean, I'm sure you have people in your life that there is so much you could tell them that would help them. Right? Even stuff they desperately need, such as, you know, if you stop driving the knife into your head, you'll stop bleeding. Really? You think so? You know, and it's just like, there's nothing, you just can't say it, because they'll say, what knife? Or, what knife? You know, it's more how the answer goes. You're always telling me things like this. But how can you teach someone who won't ask and doesn't have the humility to know? You think it's really different? You think that the guru-disciple relationship is anything different than whether you're willing to listen or not? And on what level we're willing to listen? But you don't want to listen to fools. Don't. Swami Kriya Ananda himself, he said, he went across the country in a bus 5 days from New York City to Los Angeles and sat before Yogananda. Yogananda said, I mean, it's an amazing scene, what may I do for you? Swami said, I want to be your disciple. He didn't even say good morning. He said, I want to be your disciple. And Swami himself said, I never imagined saying those words to anyone in my life. I mean, talk about, being always the leader of the pack. It was just unthinkable to him that he would put himself in that kind of relationship to anyone. But he had the humility to recognize wisdom when he saw it. And that was his great, his saving grace and the great good karma that he had. And so that's what Yogananda's talking about. And then he tells, this story after story about looking for his guru and then meeting him in miraculous circumstances and then arguing with him at their first meeting. At the first meeting, his guru tells him certain things and Yogananda folds his arms and says no. Just like that. No, I'm not going to do it. And there's lessons in all of this. I remember Swami Kriya Ananda himself. I got myself in a very complicated situation where I thought competent people were competent without help. And therefore, if you were going to prove that you were competent, you didn't ever let anybody help you. I had a lot of things to work out. So I was responsible for this business that I couldn't operate at all because I have absolutely no talent for business. But I was the best he had, so I had this job. And it was also a project between us, spiritual project. So Swami kept trying to help me and kept making suggestions to me, and I kept saying, yes, sir, and just doing none of it. And accepting no guidance, nothing. This went on for about 2 years. Yeah. And I was getting more and more tense and a little angry because I was running in circles, so therefore I was exhausted all the time and thought I was working hard. I didn't understand the difference between a circular and a linear, pattern, but I was a mess, and so that was what was happening. And after about 2 years, it finally hit the crisis point, and Swami said to me, you always wanted to look like a good disciple, basically, by saying yes, yes, yes. He said, but I far prefer an honest no to a yes that doesn't have anything behind it. And he said, you never fooled me. And then I had this wonderful moment, which is, good gosh, what a waste of energy. But when you think about it, when people are just shining you on, as we say, you always know it, don't you? Yeah, you can tell. Everybody can tell. And it's just a total waste of time. But nonetheless, Yogananda demonstrated from his very first meeting with his guru that to be a disciple does not mean that you're mindlessly acquiescent. It means that you have to work it out. And so he gives us this whole story of what it looks like when you have to work it out. He only starts there, then he becomes quite obedient to his guru. But in my life, when Swami Kriya Ananda walked into the room, he hadn't even spoken. Friends of mine said, we've met a true teacher and we think you'll like him. A woman to whom I owe everything still. She's a lifelong friend. And he walked into the room, he never spoke. He just walked in, I could feel it. I could feel that this was the consciousness, this was it. I don't know how else to say it, that was it. I was looking at it. First time in my life I'd ever seen it. I'd ever seen someone functioning from an entirely different level. And I recognized it as what I wanted to have, and I never looked back, have never looked back. I've had a whole lot of mental mess to sort out, so it hasn't been like clear sailing. But I always knew what I was looking for. And I feel like I thank you, God, every day. I would fall on my knees right here, but it would be over dramatic, but consider it done. Okay? That's it. So Yogananda brought eternal verities, the relationship with someone who knows, right? And the necessity for you to really work that out and recognize that the disciple's part comes first. And then the guru, because the guru is always there. The guru, it's very interesting to think about it. The guru never changes because there's nothing to change. He's in a state of perfect oneness, stillness. He has no agenda. He's just waiting to help us. So all of this shifting and oscillation is on our part, just trying to align ourselves with the simplicity of that vibration. That's what John Tettemer realized, that all of this theology was just put on top of it. The only thing that really matters is this relationship. So Yogananda is taking all of Kali Yuga, all of the material age, in which we have these huge churches and we have these priests and we have these dogmas, and what happens to the unbaptized baby? Well, he goes to limbo, but then the Pope later dissolved limbo. I have to tell you, one of my friends, then someone said, well, what happened to all the babies that were in limbo? My friend who had been a Lutheran priest said, they gave them to the Hindus to reincarnate. But you know, the theology, if you start thinking, it gets really complicated. Yeah. My friends who grew up Catholic, my friends who are of my generation, grew up Catholic, and you know, pennies for the pagan babies was a part of their childhood. You put pennies in these little boxes to pay for the missionaries who would save, I don't know how they would save the pagan babies. I suppose they would baptize them. And then once they were baptized, they would get to go to heaven instead of having to go to hell. Oh dear, this is very hard, you know, very hard to understand. And you know, sometimes when you're with Catholics, as many of the light bearers, the ministers of our church were Catholic, and every so often they'll start in on their catechisms, you know, which they memorized as children. It's just like, wow. You just like, where did all that come from? But Yogananda respectfully, but emphatically, just gathered the whole thing up and threw it in the ocean and said, your spiritual responsibility is yours, and you do need mentors, you do need teachers. You see, that's the important caveat that he put into it. Because a lot of people, and this is how it always works, there are these very big ideas, and source matters. When people offer me teachings, I always ask who said that. Because merely because it was said, now it's, I read it on the internet. You know, now that it's on the internet, or it was channeled from the other side, or something like that. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valid. A lot of what I do is on the internet, and I stand behind it, right? It is alternate facts, I agree. But nonetheless, you have to know where it comes from. And what you have when you have a source like Jesus or Buddha or Krishna or Yogananda, I will put Kriya Ananda not quite in that class, but definitely a source worth trusting, that it's from the top of the mountain looking down, in which all the cul-de-sacs and all the possible valleys and ridges are perceived. And another aspect of the master's life, which Yogananda emphasizes almost too much in Autobiography of a Yogi, and which is why Swami Kriya Ananda wrote The Path, which was his life with Yogananda, was because Yogananda makes it seem as if anybody can just go to India and, as we say, stand on the corner like this and wait for a guru to touch you on the chest, and it'll just be that simple. Or I'll just walk into the mountains and Babaji will call me. You know, they thought it was the guru-disciple instead of the disciple-guru relationship. And Yogananda himself just makes himself seem like an avid, but a more or less ordinary seeker who just had all this, you know, really good karma there. And so what Yogananda saves us from is, yes, it's all in our hands. Yes, we are inherently one with the infinite, but by adding that disciple-guru relationship, he also saves us from our own arrogance and ignorance. Because what unfortunately happens is people from here get a little look at it, and then they start sincerely working as if they were from the top of the mountain. And that's basically the way it works. The water flows from the highest level, and it assumes many different shapes and forms. And when you're trying to change a whole society, which is what Yogananda came to do, to launch and make that happen, then it just happens in many different ways. When something was happening at Ananda and we were being terribly persecuted by our neighbors, oddly enough, our neighbors were the most antagonistic to us. And people across the world loved us, but our immediate neighbors were just always on us. There were a lot of super dropouts. And we were the only authority in town, so we were the only thing that they could fight against, so they fought against us. But the game was that they would knock down our mailbox. And then we would build bigger and stronger mailboxes, and then they would keep knocking them down. Finally, the man sunk concrete 4 feet in the ground and had this concrete column and then this metal box bolted onto it, which lasted about 3 weeks. and it couldn't be pushed over with a truck, but finally somebody pried the box off. And I think when they pried the box off, I came and told Swami, and his house then was just this one dome, and I used to cook for him, and I would be up in the little kitchen part, and he would be in the office part, but it was really just one room with partitions because it was a dome. And we'd had this conversation, then I'm up there making lunch or tea or something, and he's at his desk, but we can talk. And he's typing, and then he stops, and he has this really big voice. Asha! We're trying to transform all of society, and naturally it will take a little time. And then he went back to typing like this. And Christianity was really invisible for 300 years. Yeah, it just really nobody noticed it. Nobody, if you'd asked in any of that time, is it ever going to be what it is? Nobody would have believed you. So our responsibility, as I see it, is to understand what we're actually doing and do it right. And, whether it's a popular movement or unpopular, it doesn't matter as long as we do it right. Spiritual responsibility is in our own hands, but there are those who know. And that doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. That basic humility and reverence for wisdom where you find it is inherent, but you have to do your own part of it. It's not enough to say, I believe. And, there's a lot of truth to Jesus dying for our sins, and he is a true Savior. All of that is true. But the mere fact that he did that, and now I say, great, I'm free. Try it, For some people, the disciple side of it is so powerful that it actually does work. But Master gave us Kriya. You can sit down yourself, and then you discover really why we are all one and why all religions are one. Because we move outside of time and space and physicality. We go right into that energy in the chakras. Now there's one more part of this, and I'll introduce this briefly and then we'll take a very short break. Master also brought in the feminine side of God. Now don't mistake that for women are more important than men. I am, as you might have noticed, a female, and I have been a female for a long time. Not only in this life, but when I think of myself, I tend to always see myself in a female form. True or not, I don't know. But I'm a female person. But female and male are not the realities. The realities is there is feminine and masculine in creation. Creation is dual. There is always active and receptive. There's initiating, and there's always these dual forces. And we have two kinds of bodies because we also are just sort of acting this out. And it's true also that women are asserting themselves because there is a necessity that the feminine side has to be balanced. We have to balance an over-rational approach to life, over-materialistic, all of those things. Women are making some super serious mistakes by trying to assert the feminine by being as masculine as they can be. Recently, there was a little hoo-ha. I don't generally keep up with the news, but I get enough of it. I happened to be away from home when this happened, but in my little world, some Google executive wrote some kind of a memo in which he said that women are different than men. And that just caused this incredible blow up. And he was eventually, of course, fired, And among the things he said, and the reason that women don't function as well, is because they want a balanced life. I just got fragments of this controversy, so maybe I have it all wrong. And everybody got really excited. I thought, for heaven's sakes, women, stand up and say, you're damn right. Are you out of your minds? Of course we want a balanced life. That's the whole point, isn't it? Why is that an insult? I think that's an enormous compliment. And there was a whole lot of the accusations that to me seemed like, far from getting upset, they should have stood up with pride. That's the whole point. That's why we're here. We're not here to run the same wacky system you've been running. We're here because you're as unhappy as we are. It's just that it's the Shakti, the female side, that responds to how it feels, and the female side tells the masculine side, do something about this. I mean, in its worst form, that's the nagging wife. But in its best form, the feeling side of our own nature motivates us to take action. And that's really what's supposed to be happening. Now, this has also, again, this little thing is because of something much higher. When Jesus came, God to the Jews was a stern judge. And those priests had worked out hundreds of laws. You break any of them, you're done for. And a whole lot of them had to do with all the things you had to bring to the temple. And lo and behold, ended up, in the stew pots and in the wallets of the priests. I mean, they had a great system going. And God was to be terribly feared, and if you just stepped a tiny bit out of line, whack, the vengeance of the Lord, it's all over. I mean, this is not a really happy situation. Who wants to live under something like that, especially when the priesthood is corrupt? So Jesus came and he said, God is your father. He couldn't take it all the way to the mother. It was too far a leap. But he could say, God is your father. If you ask your father for a loaf of bread, will he give you a stone? And you had to say, no, of course he wouldn't. And the story of the prodigal son, he comes back. Instead of being thrown out, he's welcomed. And in theory at least, everybody knows what that feels like. So then we've been living all this time with God the Father. And God is the Father. See, again, women are making a mistake. We have to make and they just randomly flip he and she in the scriptures. But he is the impersonal wisdom aspect that just impersonally does just define what divine law is. Not priestly made law, but divine law. Guess what? If you're constantly selfish, you'll end up with no friends. That's divine law. I don't have to make that rule, and no governor has to make it. Try it. See if it works. Take your finger, put it in a candle, see if it hurts. This is not, as they say, rocket science. This is divine law. This is how it happens. Okay? And there is a reality to that. Then there's the mother that says, oh, honey, I know you've broken all the rules and you're just an absolute schmuck, but I love you, And that's also, God is also the mother. And just can't, as Yogananda says it on this tape of his own voice, he says, I love this, he says, pray to the mother, pray to God as the mother. He can't resist you when you do that. And that just puts it perfectly. In other words, there's the impersonal and the personal. Call on the personal. So in addition to, it's in your hands, you can do it yourself, Yogananda talks repeatedly that God is a loving mother. Jesus took us to the Father, Yogananda is taking us to the mother. Because what that is, and Jesus had the mother, but and it wasn't the Virgin Mary. The mother is the Holy Spirit. Because the Holy Spirit is everywhere and always with you. And you can always call on the Holy Spirit. And then he even did it even better. After I am gone, I will send the Comforter. I mean, think about that. I will send the Comforter. I mean, in the silence of your own home, at your lowest moments, what is it that we long for? Above all, that's what we want, isn't it? And Jesus told us, I will send the Comforter. But Master could say, Divine Mother. And just put yourself on the lap of Divine Mother. She will never turn you away. And he has all these wonderful poems. Some of them are in there. I am your naughty baby. I will cry and cry and cry, and I will not be satisfied with toys anymore. Now you must come and comfort me yourself. But you see how different that is than so many ways that we've thought about these things? And how perfectly it resonates with our hearts. This is the revolution. And this is what he's really here to teach us. Now, you all have been sitting for an hour, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And here's my rules for breaks. You may not start a separate reality anywhere. There's 2 bathrooms there. I don't know what about water, but don't create a whole new thing. Just make yourselves comfortable, relax for a minute, then come right back. Okay? Why don't we put in a song? Why don't we put absolutely? During the break, I was basically asked the question, which was the program last night. And so for those of you who weren't here last night, I encourage you to see it when it goes up on the internet, which probably will be not until after we get home. But in any case, let me just think how to put this together. George Washington Carver was a black man right after the Civil War who was a scientist, who was really a saint, who incarnated to help the black people move from being slaves to being free, because they'd been generations of slaves and they really did not, many of them, know how to take care of themselves. I mean, it's just a natural, process. He was a very saintly soul who incarnated. The slaves were emancipated, I believe, while he was still a baby. So he never really consciously lived through that system, but he was there at that time. And he helped not just the black people, but also the white people, the poor white people in the South, by enormous agricultural innovations. And his interest was in botany and plants, but his nature was really saintly. Our elementary school that Ananda runs, every year we have a huge theater production in which we dramatize the life of some great soul. And all 70 of our children from kindergarten through 8th grade act in the play, and they get to say the lines and live the stories. And so we've done from the Dalai Lama to the story of Jesus, to the life of Moses, to Martin Luther King and George Washington Carver and Yogananda last year. But when we did George Washington Carver, we all learned a lot about him. And there's this wonderful story, there's a biography of him called The Man Who Talked to Flowers. And every morning early he would go out and nature would talk to him and he would talk to God through nature. And the story is told, and George Washington Carver is most famous for the fact that he discovered 500 uses for the peanut. And peanuts were something that grew extremely well in the South, but there was no monetary benefit, or insufficient. So he created all these ways that they could make money off of what was already happening. It was a huge, important innovation. So he was in the forest, and he was talking to God. And he said to God, "God, why did you make creation?" And God said to him, this is how George Washington tells the story, Carver tells the story. And God said to him, "George, that's a mighty big question for someone like you." So then George says, "Well, God, then why did you make me?" And God said, "Better, but still mighty big question for someone like you." So then George said, "Lord, why did you make the peanut?" And God said, "Now that's something we can work on together." Now, the question that people are asking, I'm talking about Yogananda's spiritual revolution and all of these different things, and I'm talking about Divine Mother and doing your kriyas if you feel to, and and being humble in your receptivity. And then we're talking about genocide, and we're talking about atomic war, and we're talking about starvation, and the list is, I don't have to go there. I have my own list. I can talk about education in America. I can just get really excited. I can talk about popular music. I can go there for a really long time. It's a mess. You just look out there and I've retreated more and more into, the privacy of my own home. It's just like it's not a world that I feel very much at home in. I never have, but even less. At the same time, it's like we can say, it should be different and I must make it different. Why aren't you making it different? Why isn't everyone making it different? I think that's a mighty big question. What is really the purpose of this planet? Why are we really here, and who's really in charge? The saints often give us answers which are not necessarily intellectually satisfying, but are still worth listening to. Anandamoyi Ma said, "Don't you think the one who made it knows how to run it?" That was her answer. A disciple of Ramakrishna, when he was trying to sort of feel responsible for everything, Ramakrishna, just in his childlike way, looked at him and said, "What did God do before you were born?" Which is, answers like that are just a way to sort of startle us. And sometimes we have to realize, and this is a very serious, very personal concern that you have to think about. Sometimes we prefer to find ourselves completely confused by big questions, because then we don't ever actually have to do anything. Because we can be so confused by big questions that we don't have to take small steps. Like if George had just insisted that God tell him why he made creation, he never would have found out about the peanut. We're getting back to the disciple-guru question here. It's not just a question, and it also, how do I say this? There comes a point, and this is also where in the Autobiography of a Yogi, it's very strongly written in there in many different places. You know, if you breathe the free air of this earth, you have an obligation to serve. We are interconnected. Last night I spoke about this at great length, so I don't want to repeat myself, but we are part of a greater reality. But our responsibility is not for the whole. I mean, think about it. Did you make it? Did you even, yes, on a soul superconscious level, we chose our incarnation, we picked everything that we're here doing. All of that is true. But consciously, a person will get sick and can't cure themselves. You know, your hair starts turning gray and you have to resort to a product. You can't keep it. You know, it's just like, how much mastery do we actually have over this plane? Very little. And yet we'll sit there and talk as if, you know, why can't we all just do this? Well, because often that's easier than actually transforming ourselves, working on the peanut. You know? And it's stages of development. You know, I'm not talking about the fun of intellectual conversation, because some people like it. But Swami Kriya Ananda mentioned something. He went to some university, some notable university with very, very smart people. And he said it was one of the most interesting lectures he gave because they asked such interesting questions. You know, they were very bright people and asked very interesting questions. But they asked a lot of questions and always had another one. But he realized after he left that none of them would change. That they would all go home and think of more questions. And then the next day they would ask more questions, which is really better than being asleep and not having good questions. And Swami was honest enough to say it was fun. But he also said they're enjoying asking questions. The disciple-guru relationship. You know, in my spiritual life, many times people would ask me things. When Kriya Ananda was playing, did play and does play a very important role spiritually in certainly my life and the lives of many. Well, was it Kriya Ananda? Was it Yogananda? Who was really acting? Was it Sri Yukteswar? Was it Jesus? I'm a devotee of Jesus. How can I be following this path? My thing is, look, I really can't tell the difference among all those guys. You know, I can tell the difference between me and Kriya Ananda as an example, and I can only imagine the difference between me and Yogananda. Let me close that gap a little, and then I'll worry about those other questions. And there has to be a point of humility and hunger. That is the only word I have to use. You can read cookbooks and restaurant menus and watch food shows, but none of that is the same as being hungry. When you're hungry, you open the refrigerator and whatever's in there is what you're going to eat, right? But if you're not hungry, it's a stage. And so spiritually speaking, if you just want to keep asking questions that you know there are no answers to, at least you're interested in the matter. But there also comes a point where I just want to be a disciple. I woke up, the inside of my mind is more than I can bear. The suffering I see around me is more than I can bear. Something has to change. And then you ask, give me a peach, give me an apple, give me an olive, I don't care what it is. Something has to happen here. So a lot of, Vivekananda's answer to the big, why is it the way it is and what can we do about it, was one of the most marvelous conversation enders. He just said, the level of consciousness that asks the question is not capable of understanding the answer. Which is a terrific conversation ender. Not necessarily satisfying, but it gets the speaker off the hook very nicely. Doesn't it? But it is part of it. And then we're sitting in this room, and here we are in the city of Boston, and we're in the bowels of the library. We're just way down in this marvelous cold cave here right now. We asked them to turn on the heat, and I think they turned on the air conditioning. But in any case, here we are. And then our people get up, the secret of laughter lies in the laughter, and everybody's just feeling, and I'm sitting here thinking we're changing the planet, but it's really hard to see it, isn't it? Because where does it come from? But there's many levels to this, which is really important. Swami Kriya Ananda put it this way many times, but in 1994 he had open heart surgery, and Ananda we were engaged in litigation for like 12 years. People tried to blot us out. They tried very, very hard to blot us out because this planet has to have a certain balance of light and dark because it's just at that stage of development where it just can't get all light, and thank God it's not going to get all dark either. There's a certain balance. So whenever light gets too high, dark has to try to deal with it. As I said, fortunately, we're going up. But we went through this marvelous 12 years of efforts to snuff us out. And right in the middle of that, Swami had open heart surgery, and in the night right after the surgery, he never made a big deal of his experiences. He would talk to us about what he felt, but he never said, lo, in the evening the heavens opened. But I think, lo, in the evening the heavens opened is what actually happened. And he saw the level from which things happen. And in the Autobiography of a Yogi, the chapter called The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar, which is just really a mind-bending chapter, when he talks about the physical plane, the astral plane, the causal plane. I mean, you read that book every year in your life, and you're reading the same copy with your name in it and the notes that has been on your shelf the whole time, and someone came in and put more pages in it. I mean, it's a fact. I know it. I absolutely know it. Those pages were not there. The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar is one of those chapters. That your first book only has a couple of those pages. So read it every year because it grows. But he talks about the causal, the astral, and the physical. And this concept, there's a number of key concepts, and this is one in terms of why secret of laughter really is important. Everything happens first as an idea. This is no matter how big this is so wonderful about the spiritual path. No matter how expanded it gets, you can also see it. Everything that happens in your life begins with an idea, doesn't it? Some of it, somebody had the idea to invite me to come here. I had the idea that I would say yes, which, as I said to some of you last night, was novel because I'm not traveling at all now, but I said yes. Then somebody thought, we'll make a poster. And so there was the idea to make the poster, then someone made the poster, then someone had to take the poster and put it somewhere. Then somebody had to see the poster and have the idea, that might be a good idea. And then you had to get in your car or the subway this morning and you had to come here. And finally we're all here. But if you never had the idea and you never put the energy behind the idea, then it would never manifest. This beautiful building, somebody had an idea. This was an idea. And then look at all the energy, that's the astral level. The idea is the causal level. The energy is the astral level. There were blueprints, there was money, there were plans. I mean, God knows what it takes. And then a whole lot of energy applied, and now we can have a class here. Now, this whole creation, this is what Sri Yukteswar is explaining to us, it's everything that happens here starts as ideas. And what we're in right now is we are in a war of ideas. We have the Taliban over here, which has an idea, and they're putting a tremendous amount of energy into it, and it's resulting in people getting their heads cut off, and ancient statues being destroyed, and women not being allowed to be educated. But all of that starts with ideas. And if those ideas, people, once they accept those ideas, then the energy and the manifestation takes place. But the real war is on that level. And the war that's going on is there is no God, life doesn't really matter, and as I was saying last night, if I can get it for myself, why shouldn't I just take it? And that's what we're seeing. Those are the enemies. Swami wrote a script for, the movie was made. The movie is called The Answer, and it will be released in the spring, and it's based on his book, his autobiography, The Path. So it's his search for truth than meeting Yogananda. It's a dramatization. It's absolutely beautiful. When you see it, you'll just love it. It was made by an Indian director. It's just a gorgeous film. It's won 20 awards. It's really a lovely movie. So what was the point of that? So part of the script, and I don't really think it ended up in the movie, but it was part of the script Swami wrote. He was creating the sense of drama by a young man who wants to commit suicide. His mother has discovered he's going to kill himself. In a panic, his mother brings, this is the play, brings this young boy to Swami and wants Swami to persuade him otherwise. So Swami starts talking to him about ideas, because the reason he wants to kill himself is, look at the world, what's the point? Like this. But Swami says, nobody is threatening you. You're not in any danger. Absolutely nothing is happening to you. You're being defeated by ideas. You see, isn't that interesting? Because what does make a person, in the community that I live in of Palo Alto, because of all kinds of other things, we have an ongoing problem of teen suicide out of the most privileged schools, because those children are succumbing to these nihilistic ideas. And the pressure is too much, and they don't want what they're being offered, so they do terrible things. It's unbearable. It's just an unbearable experience for everybody, but it's there because the ideas that are being, propagated in our culture, atheism, materialism, selfishness, so like there's no purpose in life except to get stuff for yourself. That's basically what you're working with. It's just crazy, but it's only ideas. And so Yogananda writes this book, which is filled with completely other ideas. The purpose of life is to realize God, cosmic consciousness. His guru does touch him on the chest, and he goes into cosmic consciousness, and suddenly breath is withdrawn, and he can see through the buildings, and the cow coming down Raigat Lane, for those of you who've read it, was equally visible when it was outside the fence, and then when he was on the other side of the fence, he could look through the fence. And this is so trivial, but the cow is going down Raigat Lane. But everything has shifted, and Babaji lives in the Himalayas eternally and has his body, and he'll never die. And if you call on Babaji, he will come and bless you. And now, when you first hear that, that's not your experience, but that's an idea. But wow, what an idea. And what are the implications of that idea? So everything that we're doing is, and this is what Swami's vision was, we are engaged, and at that time there was an effort to snuff Ananda out. We are engaged in this war of ideas, and it's our privilege to be part of it. And we express those ideas merely by how you respond to a friend. Everything just oscillates out in small circles because we're all interconnected. There's absolutely, it's marvelous to think of. Go forward and backward in history, forward and backward in your own life. There is absolutely no way you can cut yourself out from the fabric of the whole planet. I'm standing here because of anti-Semitism in Poland. At least if you think of it genetically and family-wise, that's how I ended up here. Of course, I actually think that karma trumps heredity, but nonetheless, DNA is created by karma. Karma is not created by DNA, is what I'm trying to say. Causal, astral, physical is how it really works. But nonetheless, look at the pattern. Everything here is all interrelated. And we think that the material is more powerful because look how big it is. Gosh, I can't move it at all. No matter how high. I could pick up 10 of those books and that would be all I could carry. It looks big, right? But the idea would have obliterated it. If the idea hadn't started, the more subtle is really the more powerful. Think about yourself, what you're holding in your head, what your ideas are about things. It determines everything, doesn't it? What your response is. And you change that, you change everything. This world is ruled from the more subtle worlds. So even though we're just singing this song, what we're actually tuning into, you see, we're tuning in to this vibration of reality that has much more power It rules the material. And this is the other good news. God is in charge. Isn't that good news? Jesus says, because you are my disciples, the world will hate you. But be of good cheer, Jesus says. But then he gives a good reason. I have conquered the world. And that's what the whole crucifixion, I mean, it was such a gross age, something subtle like a book was not going to do it. Jesus had to be tortured and crucified and just, how much worse can you make it? I was with Swami, we went to the Uffizi in Florence, and we mostly looked at, the classical religious art, and, they have every way that Jesus could be crucified, they've done it. Every aspect of it. And much of it, of course, is beautiful. But we walked out. Swami just says casually, I think it's time for a new theme. He said like that. I think we've done that one. Really, we've done that crucifixion one well. But boy, did it get people's attention. I have conquered this world. Because you see, my consciousness controls my experience. It's not my experience that controls. So when we're here, just being like little children, and people at Ananda, when people first come to Ananda, we're so, I'll put it this way, I'm almost done here. At one point when I was working on a political thing in the local county in Nevada County, we were actually going to make Ananda into a California city. That was part of our relationship with our neighbors. Believe it or not, we could take our 900-acre farm with 125 people on it and make it a California city, because law is law. Law is not common sense. Law is just law. And that would give us a land use control, and it would get us away from the influence of our neighbors. So for 18 months, I worked on the project, which put me in contact with this local man who we became friends with, a prominent local man, who had his Christmas party. So he invited myself and this other woman who was an attorney, as it happened, to come to his Christmas party. So what the heck, why not? So we kind of went to his Christmas party. And we got there, and there was a piano, but it was turned against the wall, and it was facing the wall like that. And we were there for a while, and we sort of waited for the party to start. Waited for the singing, we waited for the funny stories, we waited for the people taking turns, entertaining. And we realized that all that was going to happen was that they were going to drink. It was just completely so far outside. And we saw them just begin to drink. And as they began to drink, they began to imagine they were having a good time. I mean, it was just stunning. But it made me realize, this is a war of ideas. Because this was, the only way they could have fun was to just kind of lose touch a little bit. And then they got happier. I mean, these were very fine people. And then you come to Ananda, the secret of laughter lies in the laughing. And sometimes people just like, what? And they'll just see us. We operate by a different system. You move through this world operating by a different system. Not only do you influence people, but you actually change the vibration of the planet. And do not think for 1 second that you can't do a lot with the peanut. It's the right size for us. And, that's what Master was asking us. That's what he says in 1,000 different ways. This is what we're here for. All right? Okay, we've reached a midpoint, but we haven't reached the end. Okay, we've reached 12 o'clock, and so we're going to take a break. We actually have a 2-hour break before we formally reconvene, but I've traveled a long distance, and I don't need a 2-hour break. So I'll take 30 or 40 minutes, and everybody needs food. But we're not going to be formal. So if you want to go out for 2 hours and just be outside and have things to do, that's just dandy. I'll also just be hanging around here, and we can have just more informal conversation until we get to the official time of 2 o'clock, and then we'll do something else. We'll divide up into little groups for an hour or so, and then we'll come back for another hour with me. And if any of you have questions that don't get asked informally and you really want them asked, it might help if you wrote them down. You can just write just the outline of it. And then we can sort of sort through and see the ones that are most helpful, or we can do it verbally when we come back. Did that make sense? Did you follow all of that? Oh, you're good. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Did you have anything else to say, Michelle?
So